Awesome, everyone. Hello. I'm very, very excited that you guys are all here. This is a very hot topic right now in terms of data security and ethics, and we have a great expert today speaking on it. We have Paloma from App Academy. She's done quite a few workshops with us, and every time she's done them, our community has loved it. So I'm very excited to have her here again and have her speak to you guys. A little quick background on Paloma. She's a software engineering instructor at and student success coordinator at App Academy. Much of her work at App Academy focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that are very, very important. However, prior to her joining App Academy, she worked as an ethics consultant, helping companies to improve their equity, inclusion, and diversity strategies, as well as implementing structure to aid in scaling. She holds a master from Columbia University, where her graduate work focused on ethical and legal ramifications of healthcare policy and clinical decision-making. So we've got quite an expert in here today, so feel free to ask her any questions you like. She's very, very welcoming and warm, so I'm very excited to have her today. I'm going to now give the floor to Paloma.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, y'all. I'm Paloma. I'm super excited. I'll just get into it. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen, and then we'll just talk about ground rules and stuff. So we're talking about data privacy and ethics today, which is super fun. I obviously love ethics a lot. It's what I've studied, and I think it's super duper interesting. So I'm super excited for this. Ground rules. We will have some discussion. It's a small group. So if you have a question, comment, concern, you can just unmute your mic and ask, and I'm super excited to engage and just kind of have a conversation about this. Be conscious of the space you're taking up. There's not a ton of us, so don't worry about it too much. We do have like some stuff to get through, but a lot of this goal is kind of framing how we're going to set up our thinking as developers to make sure that we're making the best possible decisions for our users. Totally fine to have different opinions than me or from each other. Like there are lots of different things that inform our ethical understandings and also inform the ways that we interact with like data and privacy based on where we grew up, our expectations, how often we're on technology, whether we're social media users, all sorts of different things. Silence is totally fine. Please close out of at least social media. I recognize we're all coding. It's a hackathon, whatever you need to do, but minimum close out of social media. And then general Zoom guidelines. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat, but really question, comment, concern, just throw it out there and we'll chat about it. So who am I? My name is Paloma Secunda. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a bioethicist by trade. That's what I studied. I'm a software engineer. So I've been a software engineer for about a year and a half now. I'm a teacher. So I teach software engineering, which I love very much. I'm an ethics consultant, which Jennifer talked about a little bit. And I'm the student success coordinator, which means that I spend a lot of time talking with students about ways that we can make sure that they're successful and that programs are set up for them. I love baking and cooking, and I love the outdoors. So this is a picture of me jet skiing in New York City. So that's who I am, but let's kind of get right into it. And you can answer in the chat. Anyone know what the difference between ethics and morals are? Difference between ethics and morals. Or if you want to just speak, go for it. What's the difference between ethics and morals? This is a judgment-free zone. If you're wrong, that's totally awesome. All good.
No idea.
Okay, no idea. That's awesome. Anyone else? All right, that's cool. So the way that I like to think about ethics versus morals is the idea that ethics are a framework that defines good. Morals are rules to be good. So a lot of the time when we think about morals, they're very internally facing. They might be associated with religion. We might have like morals within our religion. We also have like social morals of we're not going to kill and things like that. So morals are really intrinsically looking, and they're basically saying like, this is what it means to be good. Ethics defines that framework for what it means to be good. It says, how are we going to think about decisions? Are we going to think about decisions from a utilitarian perspective, meaning like best for the greatest number of people? Are we going to think from it in almost a moral perspective of like, is this the right thing to do? Are we going to think of it in like a pragmatic perspective, which is like the most sensical approach, the approach that makes the most sense is the approach that we're going to do? That's what ethics does. Ethics says, how are we going to make these decisions to define what good and bad is? I love ethics. I think it's super fun. So we have a little diagram here. Ethics involves like the reasoning that's involved. Why are we making this decision? It extends beyond rules. Ethics are usually considered universal and they're for the survival of society. So morals adhere to what is described. There are a bunch of like hard and fast rules, like thou shalt not kill, example of a moral. They're relative to society and culture, and they're for the survival of the individual. So when we think about relative to the society or culture, my background is in medical ethics. I'm a bioethicist. And the way that people make decisions varies a lot by culture. In the United States, we tend to be rather individualistic. So we like to make our own decisions. We also have a certain perspective about like how we want to be kept alive, things like that. I am half Mexican, and that side of my family makes decisions really differently. They make kind of collective decisions, like what is the best medical decision for me based on the group, and how do I want to like view my end of life care based on my role as part of a more family unit. So this is kind of ethics versus morals. If anyone has any questions on these, shout them out. So talking about ethics versus morals, answers in the chat, or you can chat it out. Anyone have any idea what data privacy is? Totally okay to guess. What is data privacy? You might have heard something in the news about data privacy because of like hackings happen, and also because of social media.
Is it protection of like personal data in a sense?
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Snaps. Yeah, we can think of data privacy as protection of personal data. Anyone else? Cool. All right, so we're going to think of data privacy as the rights of a citizen to have control over personal information that is collected and how it's used. Data protection is the way that data is stored and collected to keep it private. So for us, what that means is that as software engineers, we're very responsible for data protection. We need to make sure that we are protecting any data we're taking from a user and we're keeping it private. Data privacy we can think of as more of a regulatory thing. It's me when I go onto social media, if I have an option to say like, no, don't collect my personal data. It's the option you might have when you're going to the doctor to say like, yes, I would allow my medical data to be used in studies so that we can expand the knowledge that we have about medicine and disease and things like that. So data privacy is this right as an individual to have control over what personal information I'm giving to a company or an organization or government and how it's collected and used. Data protection is on the engineering side of like, what are we going to do to make sure that we are abiding by data privacy standards? So why do we care about data privacy? A bunch of reasons. Data privacy has healthcare information, information manipulation. This is what we think about when marketing is a great example, where we'll present certain information through a certain lens or in a certain way to evoke an emotion or a decision from a particular user. That is really important. The more information that I have, and I'll use Jennifer as an example, the more information I have on Jennifer and her likes, the way that she interacts with information, where she gets her information, the easier it is for me to manipulate that information to get her to behave a certain way, think a certain thing, anything like that. Financial information, this is hugely important. If we did not have good data privacy and data protection, then I could just like log into the bank and be like, hey, what's up with Frane's money or something like that, which is not ideal. That is bad as a software engineer. We'd be a really bad bank. And location information, which is something that's really interesting when we think about political issues. So tracking of like, was this person at this location where there was a protest or something like that? And is that information that we want other people to have? Last thing to note is data is a commodity. What that means is that it can be bought and sold, and it's one of the main assets that companies have. So when we think about Facebook or Google and all of these different things, like they get a bunch of their money off ads, but really a bunch of their money comes from user data. The fact that they have so much information about us and the way that we interact with things, the things that we're looking for, things like that. We can also think about this with 23andMe. So 23andMe, you like take your little DNA swab and then you send it in and they let you know about your genetic background, your genetic history, things that you're predisposed to, things like that. They obviously get a lot of money from people ordering their kits and doing their little test swabs and like sending them back, but they have a humongous collection of genomic information. So they have a bunch of information about what is in anyone's DNA that uses 23andMe. And this is a really important, powerful data set. It's like very important for things like insurance companies and things like that. It's also really important for medical research. So if we're able to like look at genetic predispositions on a massive scale, we can use lots of different algorithms to look for patterns and things like that. So data is a commodity, and it's one of the main assets that a lot of technology companies have, is the information on their users. So we obviously should care about this because lots of reasons. We're manipulating all sorts of things. There are laws around user data. In the United States, we think about GDPR, which is actually a European legislation. But a lot of US companies obviously function in Europe as well, especially when we're thinking about like big social media companies, big search engines, things like that. So they, even though they are based in the United States, have to abide by GDPR when they are operating in Europe. So we have to think about this a lot. And it's much stricter than a lot of the regulation that we have in the United States. So GDPR has a lot of requirements about telling a user what data you're collecting from that user, how you're going to use that data, and it gives options for users to be like, no, please don't take that from me, please don't use it in that way, or anything like that. HIPAA is really fascinating. It's Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is in the United States. This applies to clinical care providers, insurance companies, and these go-betweens that basically like operate in this middle ground between healthcare delivery and the way we pay for healthcare and things like that. HIPAA does not actually apply to things like 23andMe. Arguably, like it does, but it falls into this like really careful ground of, does that type of company fall into the categories that HIPAA is legislating for? So is it a clinical care provider? No. Is it an insurance provider? No. Is it a go-between? It's right on the line there. HIPAA is actually quite strict, but it's a little bit behind. So when we think about, and we'll talk about electronic or medical electronic health records, and obviously my background is in medicine, so I have a lot to talk about with HIPAA and things like that, is these regulations are not written by software engineers. That is just the reality. They're written by medical experts, and oftentimes they're kind of out of date. When we think about how quickly tech moves, how quickly technology moves, and how long it takes to write legislation, that kind of makes sense. Followed by the fact that a lot of legislation is reactionary. So we will, and we're seeing this a little bit right now with social media. In the United States, there's some pushes to like regulate social media more, how they interact with users, what data they collect, things like that. That is in reaction to things arguably going awry with the way that social media is currently set up to interact with users. So HIPAA is quite interesting, and we'll talk about it a little bit with regards to some companies. And then we have the California Consumer Privacy Act. California Consumer Privacy Act is almost like GDPR. It's one of the stricter legislations that exist in the United States for protecting user privacy. And as it says in the name, it is in California. So the US, fascinatingly, unlike the EU, doesn't have a central law. So there is no federal law that dictates the way that we collect user data or the way that we interact with user data. Rather, there's a lot of local laws and regulations. So it varies widely depending on like where your company is based, where your company is operating, things like that. But when we think about larger companies, they often interact with California or the EU. So they're going to basically go to the lowest common denominator and say, okay, we need to have the privacy and protections that we should have at the strictest place. So we do benefit a little bit from that. However, some companies will say, yeah, in Europe, like I'm going to be a little tighter with user data that I collect and how I use it. In the US, I can play a little fast and loose about what's going on there. And there's not a ton of repercussions for breaking these currently. So other countries also have clearer and stricter laws. So if you're interested in this, you can just Google it, and all over the world, there are different levels of strictness on user data and privacy and protections. Again, if any of you have any questions, comments, or concerns, just shout it out. So those are some laws around user data. Let's talk about data privacy risks. So things that are risking the way that we're able to protect our users are vulnerabilities in web applications. This should definitely concern us as software engineers. This is why we have cybersecurity experts and things like that. But anytime that our web application is vulnerable to a third party, or even to someone within the organization with the wrong levels of access, we are risking our consumers, we're risking our users, whether those be individuals or a business that we're housing data for. So we need to be really careful of that. Insiders and poorly trained employees. This one is also really important. So sometimes if an employee is not trained appropriately, they might choose a really bad password, but they might have a really high level of access, which means they personally are vulnerable to some sort of attack or some sort of hack or something like that. And that hacker can use that entry path, even if in theory, our web applications are built out like really substantively. Lacking a breach response. So we actually, the US got hacked not that long ago in a bunch of different places, and they didn't really realize that they were hacked for a little while. It came in through like a third-party software that they were using, and they didn't have a clear way of knowing that it was happening. And then once they did know, they're still trying to like, did we seal everything off? Did we get the hacker like fully out of our system? Did they get some sort of backdoor so they can get back in? Things like that. So lack of breach response is kind of two things. One, do we have an alarm when something goes wrong that says like, hey, abnormal behavior here, like this is not ideal. And two, do we have a clear way of handling it? Because as we generally know, speaking, when people get stressed out, they make weird choices. That's not their fault. When we get stressed out, we make weird choices. That's why we do like fire drills or tornado drills or flood drills or something like that, so that if there's an emergency, we know how to behave in that scenario. Certain companies do a great job in doing drills like this. So they'll do like security drills. Let's say that there was a security breach. What are we going to do? How are we going to inform clients? How are we going to start locking things down? Things like that. Other companies are less good, which means they might be able to see that something went awry, but they're not able to like pin it down and stop it kind of right at the source. So lacking that breach response can open us up to a lot of risk. Inadequate personal data disposal. This is the idea of a user has like disconnected from our application. They're like, I don't want to be there anymore. And we just kind of like don't do what we should do with their data. Maybe it's completely wipe that data and get rid of it. Maybe we're actually keeping data in like physical things and we're not trashing it appropriately. Whatever it might be, improper or inadequate personal data disposal can open us up to a lot of exposure. Lack of transparency in privacy policy terms and conditions. This is just bad practice, but I don't know about you. I maybe have once read a privacy policy and maybe never a terms and conditions. So this one's like kind of an interesting middle ground. Like it needs to be readable, but we also like need to provide information. We can't hide things. If we are hiding things, then our user might not know what data they're giving to us. We might over collect data, and that also opens up a lot of risk. Collection of unnecessary data. So this is the idea of, let's say that I am 23andMe. 23andMe, I collect genetic data. I also will probably collect demographic data. And I might collect other things like, how did you interact with my site? How many different pages of my website did you click through before you actually purchased something? It's all important information. If I start branching out and I also start collecting information about your medical information, so like, who is your doctor? How often do you go to the doctor? What sorts of health issues do you have? Things like that. It's not core to the business. Hopefully there's not a lot that I'm doing with that information, but it is opening up a lot of risk. Like that's important data. We don't want that data to get out. We're just collecting it unnecessarily for the sake of collecting it. So being really, really intentional about what data we're getting from our users and ensuring that we're protecting it as we should be protecting it both legally and ethically. And then just making sure that that's actually data we're going to use. All that is really important. Personal data sharing, this is people that just share their own data, maybe in a way that they shouldn't, or without recognizing what data they're sharing when they send things around. Incorrect or outdated personal data. Session expiration problems. Session expiration problems would be, let's say that you log into your bank. I logged into my bank. I'm at a WeWork. We're not in COVID times. I'm just hanging out at my desk. I have to go to the bathroom. I've logged into my bank. It is the way that it is. I go to the bathroom. If I'm inactive for a pretty short period of time at the bank, it's going to lock and it's going to say, oh, your session has expired. You are out of here until you log in again. If it's a little bit more flexible, like Facebook's going to be like, yeah, someone could post on your wall, but they're not going to like drain your bank account. So they're going to have like a longer session expiration window. But this is really important. If we're using really sensitive user data, we're going to have a shorter session expiration window. And if we screw that up, if you log into your bank once and then it never logs you out, let's say I was at the library, I used a public computer, I didn't log out of my bank, the next person comes the next day and they can log in, or they're already logged into my bank, we're not in good shape there. So that's that. And last one is data transfer over insecure channels. So we like to protect our data information. We also like to protect our web applications. So if we send data over a way that's not secure, one, that's threatening the user data and that it could be taken in a way that we don't want. And two, that's actually opening us up to things getting transferred back in that might be negative for us. So these are a lot of reasons that we care about it, but these are a lot of the risks that are posed when we don't ask these questions, when we don't think about these things. Cool. Anyone have any questions, comments, or concerns so far? Looks like we are in good shape. Awesome. So some statistics. 82% of Americans said that they were worried about data security. So a lot of people view this as an important issue, which they should, because it is their personal information. 95% of Americans are worried about companies collecting and selling their data without permission. So that is a very high percentage. People care a lot about this issue, and reasonably they should care a lot about this issue, especially considering that a lot of companies are collecting and selling data, not necessarily without permission, because it might be buried in terms and conditions somewhere, but without really knowledge on the side of the consumer, on the side of the user, that that's the way that the data is being used. This also proves that, like, if something were to go awry, there would be a ton of public pressure to shut it down. So as a business, we should be worried about that. If we sell really private personal data to something that we shouldn't sell it to, and it comes out and there's a huge public outcry, we can assume fairly well that there's going to be some legislation or regulations that like pummel us down after the fact. 1.244 billion data breaches in the US in 2018, leaving 446 million records exposed. That is a lot. This is not an uncommon issue. We have data breaches all the time. And there's some more famous data breaches that we all know about. There's some that just are kind of swept under the rug a little bit more. But it is a very prevalent, common issue. And at some point during your life as a software developer, you will probably work somewhere that will have a data breach, which we very much want to not be the cause of and we want to protect against. So 55% of consumers believe that companies should be responsible for data breaches, compared to 1% believing that the government should be responsible. This is interesting. If you look like across industries and across issues, a lot of people kind of feel like the government should be responsible, that the government should be protecting us. And this is kind of true when we think about like roads or transportation. There's a generally belief in the United States that our roads, like, they need to be held to a certain standard because we want people to live while they are driving. And the government should be responsible for setting that standard. But when it comes to data breaches and things like that, we fully believe that companies should be responsible for this, or over half of consumers do believe that. Meaning, it's very important to your company as a software engineer. So data privacy is a really hot topic right now for lots and lots of reasons. civil and political unrest, social media. Healthcare is an interesting one that people don't hear a lot about if they're not in healthcare, but in healthcare, we hear a whole lot about it. So it's really, really important that we're at least vaguely aware of it. So do you have any examples of data privacy issues in your life or in the news? You can go ahead and just put them in the chat. Frain asked in the chat, does this mean that 44% blames themselves? No, it does not mean that 44% blames themselves. There is like a relatively small perception that believes that it is like your issue and you should protect your personal data, but it's not 44%. Cool. So answers in the chat. Awesome. I had an instructor tell me that he used to work for a bank that had plain text passwords in their database. Yeah, that is definitely a data privacy issue. We should not be saving plain text passwords. We should be hashing our passwords so that we cannot be able to access other people's banking information. So snaps around instructor for warning them. Sucks that they ignored him. But yeah, that's a great example. Any other examples of either like famous hacks that we know about or general data privacy issues? Cool. Some of you might know there was a hack a few years ago of, I think it was Experian. Don't quote me on that, but it was a credit reporting agency, and like all of these people's credit history was taken out, and it was a huge, 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 huge breach. It impacted lots and lots and lots and lots of people. Another one is Parler recently was like shut down, but engineers were able to like send requests and get information that they should not have been getting. Just going there. So that's a huge issue. Yeah, there's a Zoom bombing hack. Absolutely. So there's lots and lots of issues, and it's not super uncommon. Cool. A common thing is you'll sometimes get an email that's like, hey, your data may have been compromised. Please change your password. Or if it was more serious, you'll get something like, hey, your data was compromised. We're really sorry. This is what we're doing to fix it. That's the email that you want. You want them to be letting you know and letting you know what they're going to do to fix it. And on the software engineering side, we want to be able to say like, hey, this is what happened. We see what happened. This is what we're going to do to prevent it in the future. Cool. So some recent issues that have gained some attention. Some of these are less recent. Some of them are more recent. Contact tracing is a really interesting one. So our phones, we can like download contact tracing apps. Some of them are like accessible to us in the App Store. Some are built into things like iPhones, and they alert you if you have been near someone who has tested positive. This is very interesting. There are a few different ways we can use it. There was one with like geotagging locations. There's another one with Bluetooth where it'll basically say like your Bluetooth is on, and if your Bluetooth is connected to someone else that later tests positive, you'll get an alert. But it brings up a lot of issues of like, should companies be tracking our movements and our movements like that? The contact tracing is often like not run by the government. It's often like outsourced to a private organization, and like, are they protecting their user data really well to say like, you as a user have tested positive for COVID? Are they keeping that locked down and sending it to the appropriate people? It depends. A lot of contact tracing companies were like spun up really quickly. Some by newer devs. I had a student that had an awesome contact tracing app that I believe is now being used by the state of Arizona. And they spent a lot of time thinking about these things. But it does like bring into question, especially when we have an emergency like a pandemic, like how much structure and safety are we building into these things? Electronic health records are the nightmare of every doctor and likely of you. This is really challenging. If you go to the doctor one place and you go to a doctor another place, you have to refill out all of that information. There was this brilliant idea of like, let's stop using paper, let's use electronics. But that did not go well. It ended up taking like way more time. Doctors generally don't have a good relationship with electronic health records. Electronic health records are open up to a lot of liability because it is part of HIPAA, because they're used by doctors and medical systems. We can't really share that information well, so it's not really solving the issue that we intended it to solve. So there's lots of problems there. Protester tracking. This is kind of a hot topic, but with a lot of political unrest all over the world, but also here in the United States, the idea of companies like know where we are. based on like geotagging information, based on if we like were active on social media at a certain time, things like that. There are also, and we'll talk about this at the bottom, government and law enforcement use of data. There are often also a bunch of companies that have like facial recognition softwares and things like that. That is personal information. And some of these facial tracking softwares just like scrape the web for anything that is publicly available. And they can find things that like go back quite a long time. Is that something that we're totally comfortable with? Data for research. This one is super fascinating as someone who like loved to get into data banks. When you tick that box at the doctor of like, yes, I consent to having my information used for scientific study, scientific study can sometimes be stretched. We also have a lot of data banks, and there was a bunch of research that basically said like a bunch of these people didn't consent to having like their photos as a part of this photo data bank that trains like facial recognition software or something like that. Databanks that are supposed to be protected might be used by an academic person, and that academic person might publish it or publish it to a third party. So there's just a lot of different challenges that happen there. Selling information for targeted marketing is kind of, the issue at this point in time of like, how are we reinforcing echo chambers by seeing like what people interact with, how they interact with it, everything like that. And then this idea of de-identified information. So I like to think of this in terms of genetic information. We think of like DNA as de-identifiable. We're able to sell it as de-identified information, but it's not actually de-identified. I think the most recent statistic is 86% certainty that if we have like your full genome, we can track it down to you with an 86% certainty. That's not ideal. That's not super de-identified. And we can get to lots of different things like this. Like if I'm selling a bunch of marketing information about you as a person, there's likely a certainty that we can track it down to you. You are, we'll go with me, a woman in your 20s living in New York City who works for App Academy. It begins to get very, very, very narrow. So is it really de-identified? Are we selling like de-identified information, or are we selling information that just lacks a name or something like that? Cool. So all of these are recent issues that are quite interesting in my opinion. What does that mean for you? Let's talk about it. Cool. I'm going to open up the floor to chat or to discussion. Let's actually start with the reactions tab. Do y'all have access to reactions or no? Yes. Yay. Thank you, Fran. Cool. Okay. Give me a yes reaction if you have a strong opinion on data privacy or ethics. Give me a no reaction if you're like, it's interesting, but like, I don't care that much. Okay. I see one yes. I see two yeses. Anyone else? Do you have a strong opinion or do you not care that much? Okay. Some more yeses. Cool. I see one no. Awesome. Answers in the chat if you're comfortable. If you said yes, or really interestingly, if you said no, like why do you care? Why do you not care? Why do you care? Why do you not care about data privacy and ethics? Sorry, I realize these are longer answers to be typing out in the chat, so apologies on my end.
If you guys are comfortable, if you guys don't want to type out a mini paragraph, you could always just open up your audio and share through your microphone.
Oh. Yeah. If you are comfortable, why do you care? Why do you not care? You can just unmute if you don't want to type out the whole paragraph. Okay. Give me a green check mark if you're like, yes, I am totally down for discussion in a red X. If you're like, please just keep talking to me so that I don't need to chat to you. Okay, cool. I see one green yes. In that case, okay, cool. And I see one red X. Okay, that's awesome. If you gave me a green check mark and you have an opinion on this, just go ahead and unmute. Why do you have a strong opinion on data privacy and ethics? Okay, I saw a question in the chat. What's the worst that can happen with my data? I get targeted ads. It's a great question. So theoretically, the worst that could happen with your data is you get targeted ads. In the worst case scenario, you could be uninsurable. You could be denied a loan. So all of this information about like, are you a good credit risk? There's a lot of information that's just like free flowing around about the way that you make financial decisions or something like that, like you could be denied that. If your medical information is just free floating around, you might not have a pre-existing condition, but 23andMe could say like you have a genetic predisposition towards lung cancer or something like that. That could drive your insurance up or make you less likely to be insured. So on the low end of the spectrum, you just get targeted ads. On the high end of the spectrum, you could be denied a place to live, denied a credit score, denied health insurance. You could also be denied the ability to travel, depending on what information is readily accessible, what country you're trying to travel to, or anything like that. Yeah. Cool. Thinking about my community, for Black folks and marginalized folks, I've seen how the data has gone on to target the wrong person, or more likely to have the police going after the wrong person or keeping folks in databases indefinitely that prevents them from accessing resources. Yes, absolutely. Our facial recognition technology is like kind of racist and also kind of sexist. There is an awesome Joy Bulamwini, love her, look her up. She did this awesome poem called Am I a Woman or Ain't I a Woman? And it goes through a bunch of famous Black women, and facial recognition technology often shows them as men. Facial recognition technology often is also just like less accurate. With faces of color, particularly like the darker that the skin gets, the worse the facial recognition technology is. So that is really problematic. It can target the wrong people, and it can keep already marginalized people more marginalized. So that's super not ideal. I completely agree. Cool. Let's move down. So what do you think ethical behavior is in this context? Is ethical behavior just letting users know what data you're going to use? Is ethical behavior having really strict government regulation? Is ethical behavior allowing companies to police themselves? What is ethical behavior? Another comment in the chat says there are also those social security and other sensitive exposure risks, super expensive to take care of, and the government doesn't help too much. It takes a long time to resolve. Absolutely, 100%. Certain issues are expensive to deal with. And unfortunately, when we talk about marginalization, communities that have the least access to resources to be able to handle something like a social security breach or something like that are also ones that are often targeted by these types of issues. So 100% agree. Cool. So what do we think ethical behavior is? If you think ethical behavior in this context is consumers just having access to how their data is going to be used, give a green check mark. If you think that ethical behavior is strong government regulation, give a red X. And if you think that ethical behavior is businesses policing themselves, give me a thumbs up. So thumbs up, businesses policing themselves, green check mark, just let consumers know what's going on, and a red X of strong government regulation. I saw a green check mark. So just let consumers know what's going on. Just be super clear. Cool. I agree with that. Awesome. So we just want to let consumers know what their data is going to be used for. Green check mark, do you think it's important that they know what the costs of that might be? So if you just said like, hey, Paloma, I'm going to be collecting like your age, how you interact with my website, and the things you like to buy, cool. Or do you think it should say like, hey, Paloma, I'm collecting this information and it's going to be used for X, Y, Z. So green check mark if you're like, they just need to tell you what they're collecting. Red X if they're like, they need to tell you what they're collecting and how they're going to use that information. Okay. I see green check marks and red X's, but I think that they're perfectly evenly split. So we just need to tell consumers what they're collecting, and we need to tell them how we're going to use it. In the chat, I think ethical behavior is companies being transparent on what data they are collecting and how they're using it, and to be able to relay that information to users in a simple and easy way and not try to hide it in the terms and agreement stuff that they know people don't read or don't understand all the technical jargon. And of course, having the government to keep them accountable and regulated. Cool. I agree with this. I think that we should tell consumers, but I think that we need to make it digestible. There are different, I think in the United States, if you want something to be like readily accessible to everyone, it needs to be at a 3rd grade reading level, and it needs to be in whatever language is the primary language of that individual. So we need to be careful to make sure that even if we're giving that information of like, here's what we're collecting from you and what we're going to use it for, that it's actually digestible by our user. All right, green check mark. Do you think that government and law enforcement should have access to personal information via companies? Green check mark if yes, you're like, yeah, the government should totally have access and law enforcement should totally have access to personal information. Red X if you're like, no, the government does not need access to that. I see 2 red X's and 1 green check mark. All right, someone that gave a red X, go ahead and unmute. Why shouldn't the government and law enforcement have access to this? Do you think?
Again, I think for me, like, this is one of those situations where, like, if the police can use data against folks, like, they more likely will. Like, I've seen this definitely happen in my work before I was a software engineer, where there's just like long lists of databases of user data that's really preventing people from getting housing, or like, you know, is really used to target individuals without their knowledge or consent, or that constant targeting without folks knowing why, you know, has been an issue. And it impacts so many different parts of life. Like, let's say that you are targeted because of a database thing, and they make a stop and they like arrest you or something. Right now you have a record that could impact your ability to get a job, whether or not, you know, it was accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else? All right, I'm gonna add a follow-up question. You can answer in the chat or you can unmute. There was a terrorist attack a few years ago, I think in Florida, and police had the iPhone and they tried to get Apple to unlock the iPhone for them. Do we think that Apple should like unlock the iPhone in that kind of situation? Like green check mark, red X if you're like, no, that just proves that Apple can get into anyone's iPhone at any time. We don't have security at that point. That's bad. Okay, I see some red X's and a green check mark. If you gave a red X or a green check mark, you can answer in the chat or you can unmute. Why? Why do we feel that way about that one? These are tricky questions. I also acknowledge that. One other thing that I want to acknowledge is perceptions on these and privacy vary a lot by age and where you grew up. So younger generations are feel differently than older generations, and where you live in the world is a little bit differently. Yes, I can repeat the question. So in the case of terrorist attack and government has access to the iPhone, why or why not should the private company unlock that iPhone for the government? Okay, I see. Maybe in that condition, we can ignore privacy for a while for the sake of getting information on the terrorists. Wouldn't sharing that data be violating the privacy policy? Yes. I will say that there is an out in a lot of terms and conditions that basically say, like, if this information is subpoenaed, we will give this information. It exists in healthcare and it exists in other things like that. Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting case study. I am very, very torn on something like this. I am on the side of trust, meaning like we should have trust in our institutions that they will like protect us and do what they say that they're going to do with our information. With that kind of means, like, if we can unlock an iPhone for something for like national security, then I'm like, we should probably do that. We should probably protect people. But that's also assuming that I have all this faith in like Apple and law enforcement to not misuse that information to like target people unnecessarily or pry in a way that they shouldn't pry. So it's like a very, very fine line there. And wouldn't it be dependent on each country's privacy and anti-terrorism laws? Yes, 100%. As we vary by country or even county or state sometimes, we have different levels of access and those laws change, which can inform business decisions and legal decisions a whole lot. Cool. Let's move down. As an engineering working at a company, what can we do to protect user data? Working at a company, and you can answer in the chat. What can we do as software engineers to make sure that we are protecting data? There was an example earlier that I will state. If you see something like we're saving plain text password, say something and then try and create a ticket to change that practice. So that's absolutely something we can do. Anyone else? Yes, hash passwords to start with. 100% agree. I think that that is like we should really start with that. Hash our passwords to start with. Also set ourselves up to like protect from SQL injection. This really common issues that we know we can have. Yes, do audits and tests to see what breaches are possible. 100%. Make sure that you have like a breach protocol and then run audits. Is it working well? Do people know how it works? Do people know how to handle this situation? Absolutely. Anything else? Yeah, working on a secure network, avoiding Wi-Fi that can be easily hacked, 100%. Particularly if you're working with sensitive data. Cool. If you see something, say something. Train your employees. Like I hear, yes, I heard the Twitter hack could have been avoided if employees were trained. 100%. Train your employees. This is an important thing to train them on, just like any other best practices when it comes to coding. Cool. Yeah, I agree with this 100%. There are lots of things we can do. And if we ever are in the position of being the decision maker, asking the right questions. Should we be collecting this data? How are we going to protect this data? And what are we going to do if something goes awry? Are like the 3 most important questions to make sure that you're setting yourself and consumers up for success. This is really quick and easy. Green check mark if it's important to you that the company you work for prioritizes protecting data or behaving ethically. So green check mark if you're like, it is important to me that whatever company I end up at prioritizes protecting this. Red X if you're like, I don't care that much, care about other things. Like, is the job really cool? And is it where I want to be? Do they pay me enough money? I saw 2 green check marks. Okay, cool. I see a lot of green check marks. So yes, we do care. That is important. Being informed devs that are looking for informed companies can help this issue as a whole. Also totally fine if that's not a priority for you. Cool. And then with recent events, do you think that contact tracing or privacy protection is more important? So considering that we're in a global pandemic, green check mark if you're like maintain people's privacies, red X if you're like contact tracing. Make sure that people are quarantining that have been exposed. Make sure that people are not doing large gatherings, things like that. So green check mark if you're like, no, protect individual privacy. Red X if you're like, protect the group, contact trace. I saw 1 red X. Cool. This is a hard one. I see 1 green check mark of protect privacy. I see a surprise face like, Cool. Okay, yeah, I see no. This one's really hard. This one for me, having studied public health, I'm like, greater good. We need to contact trace. But it always falls back to this idea of trust. Like, do we trust the institutions and the individuals with this information to use it appropriately? Cool. Awesome. Anyone have any last questions or anything that they want to add to this discussion? Cool. I hear somewhere in the middle, it could benefit people, but it could also be misused. I 100% agree. Cool. 1 minute, my chat just disappeared. So give me a second to bring it back. What's your opinion on Facebook? Great question. It's kind of a mixed bag for me. I am on Facebook. I use Facebook. I personally like Facebook. I don't really post that much on Facebook. But for me, like I have intentionally curated my newsfeed to give me like a very wide variety of information from like people that think very differently from me on kind of every direction. So for me, I like it because it's an important metric for me to kind of get a sense of like what's going on in the country or in the world and not be stuck in my own kind of echo chamber. That said, I think that historically Facebook has like not made the best decisions when it comes to like influencing people, protecting privacy and things like that. So in my opinion, I think that it is time for kind of a more serious audit there and definitely like some better user education on like how social media works and how we're interacting with things and things like that. I do think that if we're going to write any legislation to like start policing social media or anything like that, that it needs to be written like hand in hand with technologists and ethicists and lawyers to ensure that it's practical legislation. Sometimes we have legislation roll out that like if you are designing a technology, you look at it and you're like, okay, you don't understand tech. It's basically impossible to do this. So we need to make sure that like that works really well and that we're taking the right things into account. But that's just my personal opinion on it. I think that it's time a little bit for kind of a reckoning about how we're going to like use these algorithms and things like that. I see in Canada, there has been discussion about the COVID tracing app in smaller communities. Even with the privacy implemented, people can easily be discovered and publicly shamed. Absolutely, 100%. This idea of like, is it really like T-identified or anonymous? It varies a lot by community. If you live in a very homogenous community, it can be easier to identify certain people that like meet certain demographics. If you live in a small community, it's very easy to identify people and things like that. Cool. Awesome questions and awesome job, y'all. Very much have enjoyed this discussion. So, good questions asked. Oops, wait, go back. Sorry, good questions asked. What type of data do you collect from your users? So is this data that like we need to be really careful with? Is it healthcare data? Does it say something about their finances? Is it really, really important that we keep it under lock and key? Is it something like a first and last name? Like it would be great if we can protect it. And depending on your website, like I think it was Ashley Madison that like allows people to cheat on their spouses. First and last name, really important to protect there. You can argue about the efficacy of that particular site and in general, but in that case, that data becomes very, very private data in a way that like on social media, first and last name, it's not really data that we need to do an excellent job of protecting. So what type of data are we collecting from our users? What sort of data privacy laws are there where this company operates? So if we're in the EU, what's GDPR look like? If we're in California. If we're in DC, if we're in Colorado, if we're in Malaysia, like there are different regulations, different laws. So what are the laws that exist there? How can we make sure that we're compliant? And then what sort of security do we have to prevent or to respond to a breach? Is there a breach protocol? Is there a training? Things like that. Do we do audits? Cool. That is all that I have for y'all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I will stick around for 3 minutes if any of y'all have any questions, comments, or concerns. But thank you all so much for hanging out with me today, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you so much, Paloma, and I'm so happy that you guys found this talk very, very interesting. I saw a lot of engagement from you guys. Great questions, great opinions. You can always connect with Paloma wherever you can find her, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever she wants. I'm going to post her socials in our Discord so you can follow her. If you guys have any questions, you can drop them now, or you can drop them in Discord as well, and I can pass them along to her. But if that is everything, I think that will be the end of our workshop. And I want to say thank you so much once again, Paloma, and thank you everyone else for attending and joining us today. Thank you so much, guys. Yay. Seeing lots of great comments in the chat. All right, awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joe, Kate, Frayne, Bhavya. Thank you so much. All right. Awesome. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.